Good evening and welcome to Business Today on ChannelEye. On this program, we talk about business, entrepreneurship and many insightful topics with high-profile individuals and individuals who have experience in those relevant fields. On today's episode as well, we have loads planned, so keep tuning in. This is Business. Now today's personality is an economic researcher and she is working for Frontline Research. To know about today's guest, let's take a look at the character profile.
Nashalie Silva graduated from the University of Bristol, where she studied economics and politics. Following this, she joined the European Union delegation to Sri Lanka and Maldives, where she contributed to carrying out macroeconomic research. She currently functions as a product lead within the economics team at Frontier Research. Here, she plays a key role in the macroeconomic modeling and forecasting function, as well as in the compilation of economic reports and presentations to Frontier's client base, made up of leading corporates and investment firms.
I'd like to welcome Nashalie Silva to the show. Good evening, Nashalie.
Good evening.
She is a lead researcher at Frontier Research. Now, to begin today's question, I'd like to ask you, we are having a dire situation right now. Are there any positive developments and anything that can bring us some good news?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. Like you said, it's definitely a dire situation. I think right now it's probably, in terms of the economy, the worst it's been in Sri Lanka. But if I was to really look on the bright side and try to find some positive developments, I think we have seen some over the past few weeks or over a month. And yeah, I mean, just to kind of start off, all of it is delayed action, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of better late than never, right? So one thing is that you probably know of is Sri Lanka has chosen to resort to an IMF program after a very long time of resisting it, and we've also chosen to restructure our foreign debt. So why these things are positive and important is because right now Sri Lanka's foreign reserves have fallen to record low levels. So at the end of March, out of our usable reserves, what was immediately liquid was something like $150 million, which just simply isn't enough, and it's been confirmed that it dropped to even lower levels. So we do really need funding to finance our essential imports, etc. And that's why the debt restructuring becomes a very positive thing, because now we no longer have to pay our foreign debt. It's suspended. And although we do have certain requirements we need to meet, this does take a lot of pressure off us. Like I said, it is really important to get bridging finance in, but with an IMF program as well, once that comes in, we can hope that there are a lot more foreign inflows. So yeah, these are definitely positive developments. To add on to it, I think as a result of the public pressure and the protests, there has also been certain changes, such as economic committee coming in, and it's made up of very highly esteemed, sound economists who can help us, guide us through this situation, and that's definitely positive. We've also had a new central bank governor. So yeah, all of these things, I guess, are definitely positive.
Right. Now, when we talk about developments, we've heard a lot about IMF. IMF is spoken about all over. Now, how will IMF help exactly, and will it help us?
I mean, will it help? I think yes. It is something a lot of economists have been calling for a very long time, and I think that is for good reason. With the IMF, once you enter into a program, I think something everyone knows is that a certain amount of funding does come into play. So, over the course of the program, there are certain disbursements that come in. But in addition to that, there's also a sense of credibility that the IMF offers us. So it's like a third party that is giving other organizations and other nations a sense of credibility for Sri Lanka that we otherwise wouldn't have. So with this credibility, we can hopefully, see more foreign inflows coming in, and we have seen a few inflows come in as well. And as I said, that's very important because we do need a way to kind of finance our essential imports and all of that. So those are, two positive things that it brings in foreign inflows. In addition to that, it also will help us out in the debt restructuring process. So they don't directly get involved in the negotiations in itself, but they do kind of, give the creditors useful analysis and information, and this can hopefully smooth out the process, which is something positive as well.
Great. Now, you mentioned the change in the CBSL governor. Now, what positive impact has that brought, and have there been any changes in policies?
Yes, I do personally think that the change in the CBSL governor was very positive, and the shift towards, more independent policy making by the central bank is something that's definitely very welcomed. In terms of policies, we have seen a rate hike. So that was something a lot of economists, were calling for given the inflationary pressures. So that was definitely positive, although it was a little bit higher than some expected. Other than that, there's also been, more of a kind of, he's tried to shift the money coming into Sri Lanka towards official channels. So one thing that was done was there was a ban on all imports from open accounts, which means, through unofficial channels such as hawala, etc., imports will no longer be allowed. And frankly, we do need all the inflows we can get from official channels. So that is definitely something positive as well.
Great. Now, there have been some recent developments, like you mentioned as well. And so apart from these developments, are there any measures that must be taken immediately?
Yes, other than what we've gone through so far, from what has been implemented already, I think what's most important is that it's fast-tracked as much as possible. But if I was to personally, point out a few things that I think should happen, along with, kind of promoting stability of the external sector, I think one thing that really needs to happen is, social welfare schemes should be put in place and fast. Because, it's not even an economic problem at this point, when there's a proportion of the population that is not able to meet their basic essentials, such as, food on the table. I think that's a huge problem and something that needs to be addressed. And I have seen, a lot of economists been talking about it, but I don't really see a sense of urgency or enough pressure for that to be put into place as quickly as possible. So that would be the one thing I would highlight. And then I have also mentioned bridging finance, trying to secure that as soon as possible is also very important, and I think essential now, because, that is how we will kind of finance our food and fuel imports, which are, a part of the problem, or a big part of the problem.
Right. Now, we usually think that whatever happens, it happens to us. And I'm pretty sure that Sri Lanka isn't the only country that is facing or has faced a similar situation. Are there any countries that you know of that have faced a situation similar to this? And if so, where are they now?
Yeah, so you're definitely right in saying that we're not the only ones who have faced these situations, and there'll be a lot of countries that face it in the future as well. And also, in addition to that, when people compare Sri Lanka to, or the Sri Lankan economic crisis to other crises, they usually resort to, the worst case ones that you see. And although, every crisis is very, it's on an individual basis, case by case, they're very different and not directly comparable. But, if I was to compare, I think one crisis that is relatively similar, or Sri Lanka can be compared to, is Indonesia in 1998. So they actually went through the Asian financial crisis, and they saw quite dire consequences as well. They saw their currency depreciate by about 80%. They saw inflation of about 80% levels, and I think their GDP growth dropped by about around 13%. So, that was definitely bad for Indonesia as well. Indonesia also did, seek an IMF program, and there were a lot of policy reversals, and, it wasn't an easy, smooth process, but they did get out of it, and during that time they had a lot of political instability as well, quite similar to Sri Lanka. There were a lot of calls for, key policymakers to step down. And eventually it did take a few years, but by the year 2000, they did, by fueling their exports, they kind of did come out of the crisis. They saw, I think, a GDP of around 4.9%, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 2000. And they slowly but surely did recover. Their currency never went back to pre-crisis levels, and I think that's something quite common in a lot of the crises, especially in the Asian financial crisis. A lot of the countries that were affected, their currencies never returned. But I think looking at that and many other economic crises as well, they have recovered, and hopefully we will follow suit as well. It will be a little bit of pain. Not a little, a lot of pain actually, but yeah, I mean, if you look at other countries, you can see that they do get out of this situation.
So there needs to be some sacrifice, but will definitely prevail.
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned before, the hard part is that the sacrifice is, mostly taken by the most vulnerable groups of the population. They feel the brunt of it, and I think the point is that we have to try to minimize that as much as possible, and that's why I mentioned the social welfare schemes. It's easy, I guess, for especially policymakers, to ask people to sacrifice, but right now I guess we have to take the situation we're in and put policies in place to minimize that as much as possible.
Right. Now, another thing that's essential for Sri Lanka right now are foreign exchange flows. Do you think there are any ways that we can increase these foreign exchange flows from the medium to the long term?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that would be yes, definitely. I mean, in the short term, of course, I think bridging finance is really important. We need to kind of cover the essentials first. But in the medium to long term, there is definitely, I think, opportunity for progress. In the last 2 years, we saw a lot of disruption because of the COVID lockdowns, and now we're seeing power outages, we're seeing fuel shortages, and all of these are things that definitely have affected the key export industries in Sri Lanka. So hopefully when we do get to a point of seeing stability in the country, these disruptions will no longer be a problem, and the export industries can kind of function at an optimal level, and that will definitely be something that brings in our inflows as well. In addition to that, I think tourism, that's a big one as well, because during COVID, we saw almost zero tourism. And we did kind of see it improve in these, in the initial few months of this year. But, because of everything that's happening, it's kind of, gone down again as well. Also in 2019 with the Easter bombings, it was dampened a little bit as well. So hopefully once we have some stability, that can be something, that's improved a lot and that's something that brings us foreign exchange inflows as well. And then in addition to that, I think, more policies can hopefully be put in place that directs money coming in towards official channels, because right now a lot of it is coming through hawala and the other unofficial channels. So that will hopefully be something that happens as well. And yeah, those are three quite simple ways that we can see foreign exchange inflows coming in the long term. So yeah, hopefully we do see that happening.
Now, you mentioned hawala, right? Would you like to emphasize on what that is exactly?
Yes, so essentially, I don't want to get too much into detail, but usually, when money comes into the country, in normal circumstances, you would send it through official channels through the central bank system. But the Sri Lankan the Sri Lankan rupee was pegged to the dollar for a long time, and that led to a lot of dollar shortage, and also the rates that money was being sent were obviously higher. So it's more of an unofficial channel where it happens at a higher rate at times like this, and because it's at that higher rate, you're able to kind of bring in money through that. So yeah, it's not just hawala, there's other unofficial channels as well, but essentially now that the rupee has been floated, people still are sending in money through, because it's something they have now got used to, right? Before, I guess maybe they had some worries of a risk factor, but now since you've already done it, I guess some people some individuals don't really see the point of now shifting back to the official channels, especially while there's, still shortages going on. So yeah, that's essentially it.
Right. Now, Sri Lanka recently defaulted on its debt. Can you just explain what this means?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially what it means in quite simple terms is that we just stopped paying our foreign debt because we just didn't have the means of doing it. I mean, default is perceived very negatively, and of course it's definitely not a desirable situation. But it is kind of a spectrum. It can either be that a country defaults on its foreign debt, and then they kind of have talks with creditors, go into a restructuring process, and kind of decide this is how we will pay our debt a little bit more sustainably, with the creditors agreeing on certain haircuts. Or it can go that they default on their debt and they don't actually find a way on how to pay it. They don't they don't negotiate with their creditors, and that's not concluded. But right now Sri Lanka has defaulted on its debt, and we have actually decided to enter into a restructuring process. So if it's done in an organized manner, hopefully they can kind of come out of it quicker and smoother. I think it was Ecuador where it only took around 6 months from the time it defaulted to raise its ratings back up again. So I mean, personally, what I think is defaulting on your debt is definitely it's more favorable than continuing to pay all your foreign debt but then not having money to finance your essential imports. So I think defaulting isn't the worst case scenario.
Right. Now, speaking of defaulting, do you have any idea how long it will take for the restructuring and for the IMF program to come into effect?
Yes. So, I mean, it's obviously all on a case-by-case basis. It's very hard to, forecast exactly how long it will take. But, if we do look at other countries that have kind of gone through the same thing, I mean, I'll talk about the IMF program first. So it does vary. So for Suriname, it took around 13 months to kind of, go through talks and finalize the program. But for Kenya, it took about 5 months. So it can take, I guess.
So it's individualized according to the country.
Exactly. So it depends on how long it takes for us as well. In terms of the debt restructuring, again, it's the same. We've seen different countries take different amounts of time. For Sri Lanka, I mean, I think we are in the process right now of finalizing our financial advisors for the restructuring, and we haven't really begun negotiations with our private creditors yet, or talks. So, it is something we have to fast track. We don't know exactly how long it'll take, but that's why it's really important for bridging finance to come in, to cover the financing requirements until the IMF program comes in. We can only hope that it's as soon as possible.
So do you have any rough estimation of how long it'll take?
Honestly, I don't know, because obviously things like political instability, all of that does play a part, and there is a lot of uncertainty right now. I think even we need to have a finance minister in place to kind of finalize certain things with the IMF. We have started talks, so that's definitely positive. And a lot of people are worried that all this political instability might mean that the IMF program is it will take a really long time. But if you look at certain economies such as Indonesia and Russia, they also had a lot of political instability during this time of their crises, but they kind of still managed to go on with their IMF program. That's not to say that it wasn't delayed at all, but they still managed to finalize it amidst a lot of protest and policymakers changing and all of that. So it is really hard to estimate how long, but I don't think we can hope that the political instability doesn't mean that it will take a really long time.
Hopefully. Now, we've heard a lot of saying going around, if Sri Lanka spent less, we wouldn't have ended up here. And we've heard that many times. Is this true? Is this statement true? So, you do hear a lot of economists actually say that,
when you look at other economies, even in Asia and Sri Lanka, we aren't on the top end of the expenditure scale. So we don't, spend as much as certain other countries. But what I would say, obviously, we will need to, cut our expenditure in certain places given the situation we're in. But personally, what I would say is it's, less about cutting down and more about redirecting our expenditures to the places that really need it. So, it is quite, like, everyone knows that we have a really high defense budget. And also, we subsidize a lot of things. And these subsidies actually don't target, or those who enjoy the benefits of it aren't usually the most vulnerable groups, which is not how it's supposed to be. It's usually, the privileged groups that kind of enjoy the benefits of these subsidies. So redirecting it to, more effective places would, I think, be really useful and something that Sri Lanka could definitely do. Also, every country can spend however much they want, but they need to have a means of financing that expenditure, and that's something Sri Lanka is really weak on. Our tax revenues are quite low. We don't really have a way of financing our expenditure, so I think that's one improvement that could happen as well. If tax revenues are increased and we have a way of financing this expenditure, it would become less of a problem then. So I would say, of course, spending less would be useful, especially now when we really don't have that much, coming in. But it's more about, that's not enough. It's more about redirecting it, and then also about, finding ways of financing it and putting in certain policies that will make it more sustainable.
Great. Now, as a final message, now I know that even the regular people can contribute to this crisis in whatever way they can. Do you have a message that you would like to give in how we can contribute?
Yes, I think that's one thing on everyone's minds, right? How can I help? And everyone wants to help now. I think one thing is, spending less and saving more, because right now what the economy needs is saving. Not everyone has the privilege to do that, obviously, but if you do, I think that is definitely one thing. I also think, this is less of an economic thing, but, as someone who's young and kind of does research in economics, I've realized how increasingly important it is for young people like me and you to kind of educate themselves about policies that should be in place, and put pressure on the policymakers to put these policies in place. Of course, everyone may not agree on one thing, but once you kind of have the knowledge of what needs to happen, then policymakers can also be held accountable. Because if you also don't know, then there's no one to really hold them accountable. Because this is a situation that was definitely avoidable, and a lot of economists have been warning for a really long time that we would end up in a debt crisis. But if there was more, I guess if a lot more people knew about it, it could have been a little bit different. So I guess educating yourself at a time like this is also something that's quite important, that I would say. Other than that, like I mentioned, I think the social welfare scheme is really important. So if you are, I think, if you're urging policymakers to do something, I think that's one thing that should definitely, come into the bracket of what we should do.
So the best thing that you can do right now is to educate yourself more and spend less if possible.
Yeah, those are probably not the only two things you can do, but that's if I had to tell someone. Exactly.
All right, that was Nashalie de Silva, the product lead at Frontier Research. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
And with that, it's time for us to conclude today's program. Do join us next week as well. Till then, have a good night.